Hello there. I've been doing work on something called the care penalty for a long time, basically exploring the reasons why providing care for other people, especially dependents, can lead to economic vulnerability and, in the case of paid work, to lower wages. So in this presentation, I thought I would start out with some discussion of some empirical work I've done on essential workers during the early stages of the COVID pandemic in the U.S., and then get a little bit into the larger theoretical issues and empirical agenda that's involved. So here's me in my initial sheltering in place mask. Essential workers, probably everybody knows what that means, but just to be specific, these were workers providing services in businesses that were required to stay open during the early stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. The categories were defined by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security by industry and occupation. Probably this definition is going to remain in force. Not really clear what's happening in terms of phased openings, but essential workers are here to stay. There are big differences among essential workers. Some, like teachers, could work from home, but many were required to work in jobs that involved face-to-face interaction with a pretty high risk of exposure to infection. And meatpacking workers, healthcare workers, elder care workers were particularly vulnerable. We definitely know that. So how do we figure out what essential workers were being paid? Well, there's no data on what they were paid in the spring of 2020, but we can look at the latest current population survey data, which covers 2018, and look at what earnings were in the occupation industry categories that designate essential workers. And what we find when we do this is that essential workers and other workers are remarkably similar in a lot of ways. Their weekly wages are not that different, their average age, their race and ethnicity, their educational attainment, foreign-born, really not a whole lot of contrast. It's true that essential workers tilt a little bit more towards women than men. 50% of them were women compared to 44% of all workers. 25% worked in the public sector compared to 17% for total. But what about hazard pay? We know that that is a factor that could have introduced a big discrepancy between what people in a designated occupation or industry combination were paid in 2018 and in the present. And we know from newspaper reports that some workers at large private firms, I think Starbucks is an example, were initially awarded hazard pay. This has largely been discontinued, but who knows what its future exactly is going to be. But it's worth noting that hazard has been largely considered part of the job for healthcare workers. Not for all. There are a few hospitals that have given a bit of a pay boost, but not in a systematic way. And I think it's pretty telling to look at what representatives of the healthcare industry have had to say. For instance, as one executive put it, we do not calibrate pay and benefits based on the patient's condition, and for this reason, we do not offer hazard or crisis pay. Thank you for the courage, she said. Well, that's an indicator of the kind of cultural praise and moral recognition unaccompanied by any real economic reward. So it sort of fits into the I am valuable but not valued category of, nice guys finish last. So instead of looking at essential workers as a whole, let's focus in on essential workers in care services, by which I mean care workers in health, education, and social services. They're a big percentage of this group. About 46% of all essential workers were in care services. Here you see it really tilting female, 73% women. Also tilting very professional, 60% in professional occupations, and pretty highly educated, 56% with college education or higher. This is partly because nurses and teachers are a large component in this category. And what's really striking is that regardless of gender, educational attainment, and occupation, essential care workers earned less than other essential workers in 2018, which is kind of surprising considering their higher education. So you may not be able to see these little bar charts depending on how they're being displayed, but what you need to know is that the very light blue is care services and the darker blue is other industries. And the weekly wages described by these bars are consistently lower in the light blue bars than in the blue bars. And that's true for different educational categories, and it's true for 4 different occupational categories. So there's clearly something going on that's kind of systemic. Of course, what we generally do to try to sort out these relationships that we see in descriptive data is to perform a multivariate analysis. And we have done that with this data, and I can tell you that on average, essential workers in care services earn less than other essential workers by about 19% net of controls for gender, education, race, ethnicity, and so forth. And professionals pay the largest penalty, about 23%, followed by managerial occupations with a 17% gap. So it's pretty striking that this care penalty is actually bigger than the gender penalty, measured specifically just by the dummy variable on gender net of controls. Women earn about 13% less than male workers among essential workers. And so you can see how the combination of being a woman and being in a care industry really adds up to a pretty big penalty. And it really raises issues, questions about what it is about care work that is driving this result. So before going on to talk about the kind of the theory, let me just emphasize that this finding about essential workers is very consistent with other research on the U.S. and the United Kingdom, showing penalties net of a lot of controls for working in a care occupation. And the most robust results come from a fixed effects analysis of longitudinal data from the NLSY, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. This was published first in 2001 and then recently updated and extended in time by Budig et al. In 2019. And by fixed effects, I mean that the dependent variable in the multivariate analysis is the change in wages resulting from a switch from a care job to a non-care job or a non-care job to a care job. So it's really holding constant individual characteristics that are not controlled for in the analysis. There has also been some empirical work that I've been working on with 2 collaborators on the industry level effects net of occupation. And most of this empirical work is currently out for review, and hopefully it will see the light of day pretty soon. So the really big question, the more general question, is why do some groups of workers earn more or less than others? And the obvious question is it because of who they are or what they do? Does it have to do with the characteristics of individuals, like their education, their skill, their experience? Or does it have something to do with jobs? Is it agency or is it structure? Well, obviously, it's probably a little bit of both, but I want to focus here on the structure aspects. Neoclassical economists often argue that workers get what they deserve, or at least what they want. Let me just give you a couple of memorable quotes. The rich earn higher incomes because they contribute more to society than others do. This is Harvard economist Gregory Mankiw in an article called Defending the 1% and the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which I recommend to you as really interesting reading. A more subtle, a more kind of indirect version of the same argument is employees differ in their demand for workplace flexibility and thus their willingness to pay for it. So this is Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz describing the fact that women are probably trading off lower pay willingly in return for more flexibility. So, one implication of that is it's their choice and we shouldn't really worry about it too much. By contrast, heterodox economists often argue that workers face different forms of discrimination and they experience different levels of exploitation. And sometimes this is put in terms of rents, the capture of rents that cannot be explained simply as the outcome of a competitive market process or a reward for skill, but it's kind of a return to place. It's a return to a position in a particular occupation or industry. And this argument has been used to explain why corporate executives and financial professionals have much higher earnings than other workers with the same level of education and experience. So a broader explanation of the kind of rent-based approach is that relative earnings are shaped by differences in individual and collective bargaining power. So that invites more consideration of the factors that influence the bargaining power of different groups of workers. And here's why I think feminist research on the care penalty is so useful, because it helps explain the power premium among workers in financial services. and vice versa. The business community understands this, I think, better than academic economists. And businessmen pay thousands of dollars to go to seminars like the one advertised here. You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So here's the theory behind the care penalty, boiled down to its kind of concentrated essence. Women's specialization in care provision can offer efficiency gains for society as a whole. Clearly, people benefit. Clearly, the economy needs it. But specialization in care provision reduces women's individual and collective bargaining power, and it does so for reasons that are related both to agency and to structure. So on the agency end, personal characteristics, commitments to care for others, especially dependents, increase one's own dependency, because that obligation to protect and provide is costly, and the emotional attachments that often form create a kind of prisoner of love effect. Care provision is not usually an impersonal process. It has a lot of emotional valence. The structure aspect has to do with the public benefits created by care provision that are difficult for providers themselves to fully capture or to monetize. And in fact, that difficulty probably explains why intrinsic motivation is so important to the effective provision of care services. So just some examples, or one really big example from our own job as academics. We know that service tends to be under-rewarded because individual service contributions are more difficult to define or measure than research, number of publications, or quantitative teaching evaluations. As a result, service to academic departments is usually dependent on some level of intrinsic motivation, and it's often economically penalized. It's offloaded onto those who are willing to do it. Another really important example comes from performance pay, which is common in the financial sector and relatively low in the care sector, despite recent efforts to put it into effect there. Basically, these are bonuses that are based on some measured dimension of performance. And economists here, I think, have made a pretty interesting contribution, especially the work of Bengt Holmstrom, pointing out that when you reward efforts whose outcomes can be easily measured and not the others, you basically discourage. You end up creating incentives for workers to allocate away from the unmeasured aspects of their contribution. And you also tempt malfeasance, whether it's Wells Fargo bank managers faking new accounts because they need to meet a quota, or it's teachers in Atlanta cheating on the scoring of standardized test exams because they're afraid of what high-stakes testing will do to their funding for their schools. So that's why Holmstrom and others argue that it's efficient to sort workers according to high-powered, i.e. financial, and low-powered, i.e. moral, incentives. And this is kind of the way our economy works, that we do see a lot of people, or some people in jobs where they can really capture a large portion of the benefits that they create, and because they're working for profitable firms that are willing to pay them for performance and benefit from doing so, whereas a lot of women are concentrated in health, education, social services, providing the care on which the larger system depends. Just to summarize, the care penalty arises from the difficulty of organizing care provision on the basis of purely voluntary exchange, including within families, but also from the difficulty of successfully commodifying the personal, emotional, non-standard, team-based, and public goods aspects of care provision. And this creates some issues for the sustainability of the economy as a whole. A lot of concerns have been expressed about the possibility that capitalist dynamics can penalize those aspects of care provision that cannot be commodified. And the social democratic welfare state, which is kind of a response to this larger problem and an effort to make sure that care provision is maintained, if not expanded, can social democratic welfare states withstand the effects of increased wealth concentration and intensified global competition and pandemic and other systemic threats like global climate change? And I would say this is kind of an open question. I think this is a really important challenge of the current political economic epoch. In the meantime, I'm trying to just keep going, looking at the relationship between care, occupation, and industry effects, asking like which are stronger, how do they interact, how are we measuring care, occupation, and industry, are we categorizing them correctly, is there a better way to do it? Trying to look more closely at the effects of specific values and preferences on job choice and earnings. And I just want to end with an emphasis on the need for thinking about the big picture. I like doing empirical work and multivariate analysis, but I think we're often misled by the effort to really isolate the effect of one thing in one variable controlling for everything else. And I think, what we see in the care sector is that many of the factors that are introduced as controls, like level of education or level of experience or occupation and industry, they're not really controlling for gender because they are themselves very, very gendered. And so I think we need to use a variety of methodological approaches to try to understand the care penalty better. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to any comments or criticisms you have. You can email me at nancy.folbre@gmail.com. You can find a lot of related material on my website, which is called Care Talk. You can Google that up pretty easily, and there's a lot of room for comments and dialogue there as well. So thanks again. Bye.